Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to our meeting today. I'm Jeff Gailey. I'm the president of the Grand Forks Wildlife Association. We're lucky enough to have Jesse Zeman travel down here from the Okanagan to put on this presentation today. We want to keep this respectful, especially you, Marty. We're trying to be productive here, not just start a big fight. If we're fighting each other, we're not fighting for the cause. So here's Jesse Zeman.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks everyone for showing up today. Really appreciate it. Everybody hear me from back in the...
Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, awesome. It's been a few years since we've been here. Post-COVID, the world has finally changed. We can get together and talk, all of those wonderful things. We also have a provincial election coming up. So we figured we'd come out and start to talk to people similar as we did in 2017 about what's been going on, what was committed to, and what's changed in the world of fish and wildlife and habitat in the last 7 years. So we're going to call it Managing to Zero, because quite frankly, when we look across the landscape at a whole bunch of different species and habitats, that's the world we live in. The last time we were here, we talked about Thompson River steelhead. Anybody here fished Thompson River steelhead back when they were fish? There's two of you. Okay, 3. 40 years ago, right. So that's when there were fish, right? So those fish were suggested to be listed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada about 5 years ago. We went from 5,000 plus fish showing up in the Fraser down to literally hundreds of fish now. And what's changed? Nothing. Right? Caribou. We have issues with moose up north. We have issues with mule deer. We have issues all over the landscape. You all are here because you care about fish and wildlife, because you care about hunting and fishing and letting your kids go out and do that. So that the topic today is really just to talk about how we can be an effective voice to change that trend. And I'll preface all this by saying, the folks that know me know that this was our house. And they know that the BC Wildlife Federation and I have been a passionate advocate for getting controlled, prescribed, and cultural burns back on the landscape. And you all know that we haven't got a lot of success when you don't take care of the forests and you don't have controlled burns. And I can tell you, driving down here, your place and your valley doesn't look a lot different than our valley. And our place has no trees left that are alive. Our place has nothing for personal contents. Our well is burned to the ground. Like literally everything you own disappears in the flash of an eye. So the first thing I want to do is really touch on the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project, because you all haven't heard about it. Your club has put a ton of time into it. You've also invested in it financially. You've run trail cameras. You've been out on mortality investigations. You've also looked at, all of our volunteers have gone over 3.2 million trail camera pictures for science. So I just want to give you a quick update. Some of you will be familiar with this, but I really wanted to talk about this here. So you're the reason why we started the Mule Deer Project. The Brandos, the club, have been talking about mule deer for decades. And so we turned our mind to how do we get some science to figure out what's going on with mule deer on this landscape. We had 3 study areas. So one in Cache Creek, where there was a big burn, one in the west side of the Okanagan, and then one here in the Boundary. The goal was to collar 30 does per year, 20 fawns, and then we added neonates to that as well. Neonates are right when they're born. We go out and actually collar them as brand new baby deer to figure out what's eating them, how they survive, where they survive. And I will say with that project, for those that don't know, there's 2 PhDs on that one. Chloe Wright just finished hers. She deals with the collaring and how deer move. She just defended hers last week. And then Sam Foster is with the University of Idaho, and he is doing all the camera trapping, which really looks at how roads are affecting deer and wildlife and predators, and a number of other things relates to 3.2 million camera pictures. So the summary from last spring, because we don't have all the winter numbers in, is, one of the questions is, what kills deer? Well, out of 185 dead deer by predation, cougars were the number 1, far and away. I'll leave the rest to you, but cougars, per the literature too, come up as number 1 predator. As it relates to other sources, We've got an unknown of 25. Vehicle collisions are up there. Unlicensed harvest. As you know, mule deer antlerless seasons are next to none in British Columbia. There's a few in the Thompson. Around here, there might be one tag, or it's probably zero now. Unlicensed harvest is stuff either poaching or when there's First Nations that harvest deer. I think it was like 2 deer out of our entire study area. So really not a meaningful piece. Neonate mortality. These are the brand new babies. They disappear really quick. So we had a total of 84, 34 that are unknown. And the challenge with that is when you're this big and you don't move, you disappear off the landscape really quickly. In a lot of cases, you're lucky if you find a bone. Like if there's a predator that picks you up, quite often it's bears or possibly bears, they pick you up and you disappear. So those are the pieces around how deer, what's killing deer. And then what Chloe did is she looked at survival. This is your area. What you should get out of this is that your deer aren't surviving to the same extent as the other 2 areas. Now this is only for 2 years of the study, but what you're all saying is deer are in trouble in the boundary. The harvest stats support that, and certainly the data so far supports that. Typically, you're looking for a survival rate closer to 85 to 90% in adults if you want a stable population. Fawn winter survival, this is the boundary again. This was a 5-year estimate, looking at about 64%. West Okanagan's 58, and then Cache Creek was 65. This bounces up and down a lot every year. There's a whole bunch of variables that affect it, but what you really want to see over time is hopefully a steady to increasing population. When we look at other study areas like Colorado and Idaho, where they, in Idaho, they collar typically 400 deer a year, and they predict survival based on NASA satellites. They're usually around 56% survival in fawns. And then the cumulative survival, this is over winter. In all years is around 61%. So overall, it's pretty good, but it generally seems like the boundary is lagging behind a bit. This is fawn winter survival. So from December 2018 to April 2019, again, for that year, fawn winter survival in the boundary, not looking great compared to our other 2 areas. Again, Colorado and Idaho, you're usually looking over 56%, 54% to get through the winter. So there's a lot of indicators with our limited data of a couple of years that are showing that things aren't all that great, like across the province, but they definitely aren't all that great in the boundary. Okay, there's more on that's neonates. They're pretty close, similar. They just get eaten up really fast on the landscape. That's really the message out of this. And even where they've done whitetail deer work, where there are very few predators, it seems like even if predators don't pick them off after they're born, they die of birth defects, cold weather. There's a whole bunch of things. This is a really hard part of the equation to kind of control. So the really interesting thing that we also looked at, or that Chloe looked at, because she's the brains, is where do deer die and where do they survive? And so this gets a little bit complicated, but what you should get out of this is that the higher the road density as a doe, the more likely you are to die. So what this means is that if you live in an area in the winter with no roads, you are about half as likely to die compared to a deer that lives with a road density of 2.5 kilometers per square kilometer of habitat. So what that means is you put more roads on the landscape, as an adult doe, you die more often. Your chances of dying increase. And that's not, as we said, from hunters and bullets. That's from typically predation. Now, the other piece we looked at, and one of the drivers behind the project was fire suppression on the landscape, is adult summer survival. And what this shows is the exact opposite. So what it shows is that the proportion of young burns that deer hang out in, does hang out in summertime, the less likely they are to die. So the message here is in the wintertime, when you have more roads, you're more likely to die. In the summertime, if you hang out near new burns, you're less likely to die. Everybody following so far? Okay. Awesome. And then in the winter time, we looked at juveniles, which are fawns, and same story. So your risk of dying when you're really close to a road goes up significantly. The farther you are from the road, the chance of dying goes down. So same message as with those. So I just wanted to cover the mule deer and give you an update because everybody's so passionate here. We are going to have Chloe at the BCWF Convention AGM in April, which is in Kelowna, which is really close. We will have another webinar. I'd recommend everybody checks it out. The messages out of Chloe's dissertation, for the most part, reducing road densities could reduce mortality of adults and juveniles in the wintertime. The second piece is increasing in young burns or possibly even couple walks could increase survival. So there's two messages there. Reduce the road densities, increase the open habitat, which is consistent with deer ecology. The couple of challenges, we don't have a big data set like they do all over the United States. We don't have the funding like they do in the United States, which means that we don't have this 40-year look over our shoulder. We can go, well, what's changed on the landscape and how much has it changed and what can we do to reverse it and where are deer surviving and dying? The other piece of this project that we really wanted to get at, we didn't have the funding, is nutrition. That's the missing piece, is what does the food look like on the landscape? How has it changed? So I'm going to go into fire now because that's one of the symptoms of failed wildlife management in British Columbia, or what we think is failed wildlife management in British Columbia. And then I'm going to talk about people's houses too. This is a map of natural disturbance type in British Columbia. And really what this means is at what scale and how often did we have fire in BC. This area, where we live for the most part, is typically NDT4. And it depends on who you talk to, but usually the fire interval is somewhere between 5 and 20 years, sometimes a little bit more. What that means is that on landscapes like this one, fire was frequent, it was not severe, it went through quickly. A bunch of the plants that are here need fire to germinate. We know that the fire opens up the forest floor, it lets sunlight hit it, helps nitrogen fix. There's a whole bunch of benefits for wildlife. And we know that species like here, like sheep and mule deer, evolved in open habitats, and so they're also tied to fire. So what's happened to fire? And this is a paper from 2012. This is out of Knife Creek, which is in Chilcotin. They looked at a whole bunch of trees on the landscape going all the way back to the 1500s. We do that with tree rings. And they tried to figure out how often did we have fire on these landscapes before European people showed up. So these dashes are all fires and then the severity of them, right? So in this area, what you see is a lot of low severity fires. And what we see here, this is 1900, is these check marks where we used to have fires all the time disappear, right? Shortly after 1900. So we had actually legislation that said nobody should burn. We also had the advent of Smokey the Bear. We started putting out fires. The challenge with that is that when you put out fires, you leave more fuel on the forest floor and you leave more fuel up in the canopy. What that means is that when you do have fires, they become more severe, they become less controllable, they're not good for wildlife.
Or your house.
Right, or your house. We'll talk about that. So good fire. Fire that is on the landscape frequently, that's normal, that happens at intervals that are consistent with history. And by the way, those fires weren't always lightning induced. First Nations literally lit fires because they knew it was good for the landscape and they knew it was good for growing things to eat, including wildlife. Who benefits? So we talked about vegetation. Goats, obviously. So Okanagan Mountain Park, and I know I've seen at least one of you in Okanagan Mountain Park back when it was really good hunting. We went from seeing 4 to 5 goats on inventory flights to 80 plus goats in 10 years. And if you look at the literature, what comes out of other jurisdictions, they don't even think goats can grow that fast. Sheep obviously benefit, and I can tell you that in Okanagan Mountain Park, we had a small burn about 3 years ago, and within 2 weeks it rained, and all of the sheep were on that burn, just as stuff was coming out of the ground that was this high, because it is high in digestible energy and it is high in protein. Elk, there's tons of research out in the States and there's tons of research in Alberta that shows that elk love open areas. There's better food. The chances of them running into wolves and getting eaten goes down significantly. Moose, there's research out of Alaska that basically shows the same thing, and it sometimes up there lasts for 30 to 40 years, where you get a huge bump in the moose population and it stabilizes before it goes back down. Mule deer, same thing. They like to see their predators coming. They like to see all of this understory coming up and bunch grass that comes up. I mean, this is just like the best habitat ever. And then the other people that benefit from good fire is people. By people, we mean people's budget and their tax dollars and their houses. And then, of course, all of us that like to hunt. So, we'll talk about people and wildlife a little bit. Everybody knows where Kelowna is, right? This is called the Bear Creek Valley. Now, in this valley, the BC Wildlife Federation about 15 years ago actually wanted to do some controlled burns because it's a prime winter range. Deer care about it. There's sheep there, and it's good for people's homes. We were told, no, you can't do a burn. It's too many weeds. No, you can't do a burn. There's tenure. No, you can't do a burn. There'll be smoke problems, and the health authority will have an issue. Well, in that valley, we used to live right about there. And in August, you're all aware of the fire. There was a fire that started about 7 kilometers in a straight line from our house. And it kind of sputtered for a few days. And then on Friday morning, I got a call from BC Wildfire, Fire Department, BC Park saying, hey, it's coming your way. The evacuation order hasn't been signed yet, but you guys better get your world together and you better get out. So we've already been evacuated 3 times, I think, and been put on alert. I don't even know how many times because we've had so many fires around our house. That screenshot was in the morning. That screenshot was a couple of hours later. So now it's less than 6 kilometers away from our house. This is our place at about noon as we're packing up. We got evacuated at 2 o'clock. The order came in. We left. We have kids. Loaded everything up. Horses, got everything out. By 5 in the afternoon, this is what the fire looked like. And so our house is over there. This is where the fire started on Tuesday, and it was probably right about there that morning. So this thing is like roaring straight in our direction. This is a picture from one of our members at about 6:30, I would say, that afternoon. And our house used to be right there. So this is the south side of Bear Creek Valley, and then this is the north side. So in a matter of hours, you go from being 5.5 kilometers away from a fire to your house burning down completely, and everybody else's. So we dealt with the horses, got everything taken care of, called one of our neighbors, asked them if they needed help, got everything put away for the night, had a really good feeling that our house was gone. And then I got an uncle who's also an ER doctor, and he said, hey, there's a bunch of people that live further down, a place called Parker Cove, who didn't evacuate. Now they're stuck and they're standing in the water in Okanagan Lake because they didn't get in their vehicles and leave when they should have. So we hopped in his boat at midnight and went down the lake to try to help get some people out. Everybody was out by that point. But I just want to show you a really quick video, if it works, what that fire looked like that evening. Because everybody said, we have all kinds of friends in Kelowna that said, it'll never jump the lake, we're fine. We don't have to worry about that, right? So, if this plays, here's what it looks like on our way out at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe it's not going to play. There we go. So that's West Kelowna. Those are houses that are going up. That's the other side on the Kelowna side. So that fire spotted probably like 4 kilometers in that wind. And I mean, everything there is nuked, right? So you think you're safe from fire. Here, 5 kilometers from here, 10 kilometers from here, you're not. That's the learning. Like by our house, there's all kinds of fire mitigation that's happened and thinning of trees, 100% loss. Every single tree that was thinned in that area is dead.
What was the density extend to?
Oh, yeah, in the prescription, I don't know, but I can tell you it wasn't enough. And the challenge around that is that the land manager up above that, i.e. Crown, didn't touch the land. So it's like, I was telling Brian, so the folks from the fire department said when they drove down our road and back, the fire truck, they said it was like hurricane force winds. The whole fire truck was rocking as they went in and out. So you can do little spots of mitigation, but if the land manager adjacent to the city doesn't do their job, you don't stop it. Like our house, we had a aluminum boat in our driveway on a trailer. It got blown from there into our horse pasture. That's how hard the wind was coming when it hit our place. So, and that's what it looks like after the fire. And I don't know if you can see this. Our place is over here. You probably won't be able to see this, but all of these mature fir trees in here, I would say probably 30 or 40% of them were blown over by the fire before they burned. And we're not talking like 20-year-old, we're talking like big trees that were literally blown over that fire before they got burned. And that's what it looks like afterwards. I can tell you, dealing with insurance is not fun. Trying to find a rental place in Kelowna is not fun. Trying to find a place for your horses is not fun. Having your family who used to live with you living in another house is not fun. And the thing with all this is, it's preventable. Like if we had proper controlled burns and land management, we could mitigate a lot of this risk. Here's what it looks like up behind our place. We went up there, we didn't get in to see our place till the middle of September, we weren't allowed in. Walking up that ground now, it was like cement. Like our kids couldn't even walk up there. It's like, I don't know, it's like walking on a wet tile floor trying to get up there because the soil has burned so hot that the biological material and the bacteria have been cooked right out of it. And you can see these trees, these are all firs. There's the odd ponderosa pine. They don't even have needles on them. That's how hot it was. So then you get on to...
I just wanted to say, when I met Jesse at convention last April, something that stuck with me was, how do you like your smoke? A little bit in the spring or all summer long? And that was before Jesse left his house. So this is not just because of your situation now.
Right.
You've always been passionate.
Yeah, so this to us is huge because we think it's awesome for wildlife. We're actually doing controlled burns, paying for them, working with partners. Like this to me is awesome for mule deer. It's awesome for sheep. It's awesome for habitat, and it's great for communities. So the next part is when you walk up a place that you can't even get a grip with your shoes on, you go, okay, what's going on with my soil? So we call the smart people who are geoscientists, and we ask them, why don't you come out to our place and have a look? So there's tests that they run to see how damaged your soil is. And they said that our soil is moderately hydrophobic. And what hydrophobic means is that it doesn't absorb water because all of the material, the organic material, has been cooked out of it because it was burned so hot. So what they're telling us is like, it's going to be really hard to grow stuff back. And when they did these tests, like a lot of the water, it's almost like, you know, when you wax your car and it rains the first time and it just beads off, that's what it was like. So like, we got a long road to hoe because we had so much fuel in that forest that we didn't mitigate that area. If we would have thinned it and had some burns in the past, it would have been great for deer. It would have been way better for people. And instead we have 100% mortality of trees at our place, and we have hydrophobic soil. So it's a pretty bleak situation for people and for deer. But there's places where it doesn't look like that. This is not too far from here. We went for a trip there. This is in the Rock Creek fire. So this is right after the Rock Creek fire, which was a little bit more heterogeneous in parts. It wasn't severe everywhere. And this was the year of the fire. This is the exact same tree in both pictures. And then this was the year after the fire, I believe. And you go in there, and there is life in here like crazy. Fireweed's this high. There's grass growing. There's signs of life everywhere. So not all fire is bad, and fire that's heterogeneous is actually good. Now, there's ways that we can do a better job of land management, and that is going to include logging to reduce the fuel in the forest. Even if it's in parks or wherever, we need it pretty much all over the place. So there's ways that logging plays a huge role, but there's also ways that we can change around how we do post-fire management and how we do salvage. And that means, what we're learning in this process and a number of these other fires is that when we go in and we remove all of the trees, what happens is that not only does the sunlight hammer the soil, but the wind friction that used to get hung up in the trees now hits the ground. It dries the soil out, so we invite invasive weeds. We have a whole bunch of issues that come with that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a good way to put fire on the landscape. There's a good way to reduce the fuel load, and logging is going to be a huge part of that, but there's better ways to do all of this. And then here is one of our controlled burn sites that we're prepping right now by Kamloops, straight east to Kamloops Indian Reservation. That right there is a sagebush. We call them sage trees when they're that big because they're supposed to be like this. That thing's like 100 and something years old. So that sage is so big that we actually are really worried that we're going to damage the soil. So we got a machine that goes in and actually mulches the sage first. Then we can wait till the grass grows up. We can put fire on the ground. So this is all experimental, but it's pretty cool. You probably won't be able to see this, but there's a band of rams right there. And to Kamloops, First Nation Barry, who works there, said he had not seen sheep there in 25 years. This was the day after we mulched that. In a day, all of a sudden sheep are in there using it. So again, there's ways to improve the outcome, to get good fire back on the landscape, to do good things for wildlife, and to do good things for people. So that's just an anecdote of all of these problems we have. And I want to talk about fish and fisheries because I'm sure people care about that too. And we have a couple of huge threats on the horizon that we really need to get a handle on. Anybody heard of whirling disease? Yeah? Do you? Yes. Okay. Fish you call it? Yeah. So, whirling disease is not here. It's in Yoho National Park now. They've had it in Colorado. They've had it in Montana. They got it in Alberta now. Whirling disease seems to be variable depending on the place. Colorado had rivers where what they call them wild trout. They're probably not even wild trout, but wild trout populations got wiped out. They had other places where they experienced juvenile loss of 90%. The other places where they had rivers that declined by 90%. Montana had some similar issues, not to the same extent. Alberta now has whirling disease. And so essentially, it gets into these tubifex worms. It can live in the mud, and then it infects its host, which are fish. They get this crooked tail, and they swim in circles. That's why they call it whirling disease. And so we now have that in Yoho National Park right there, which is basically an emerald lake, which is kind of the headwaters of the Columbia River. And of course, the Columbia River goes all the way down into Idaho, Oregon, into Washington State. It's one of the biggest salmon-bearing rivers, of course, in North America. We also have the Fraser, and we have Skeena here. So once you get it, you don't get rid of it. You have it. We don't know how salmon are going to respond to it. In the States, like in Montana, the fish seem to be adapting to it after having some high mortality. In Colorado, they're trying to raise fish that are more tolerant or have genes that basically help them deal with whirling disease. But the point here is once you get this, you can have severe loss. And you think about the problems that our salmon are facing. You think about rivers like the Kettle that is chronically suffering from low flow issues. And you think about how this goes across BC, we're going to have a major challenge on our hands for people that like to go fishing and for freshwater ecosystems. So now, following right on its heels are quagga and zebra mussels. Who's heard of those? Okay, good. So they've got them in Idaho, or at least they had them last year. They dumped a bunch of stuff in a river where they're trying to kill it off. But this is circling our province every single day, right? We have inspection stations in the summer. But we know that in the Okanagan, 1 in 4 boats that comes in from out of province hasn't hit an inspection station and doesn't even actually know about mussels. This is another one that once you get it, you never get rid of it. And it goes through freshwater ecosystems. I mean, the effects are everywhere. So infrastructure like dams clogs up the pipes, you need to do maintenance all of the time. Like just that cost, the province estimates, I think, anywhere from like $60 million to $160 million a year. So that's your hydro bill. Basically, if we put $1 in right now to keep it out of our province, we would save $10 in the future. So that's just the hydro bill. These things take up a bunch of algae in the water column to make it clear. They're like devastating impacts on fish. These things show up as that size, like a fraction of your fingernail. And so for both of these threats, the impact to our freshwater systems and our fish are so potentially devastating, like you will never turn that clock back if you don't keep it out. And so I just wanted to touch on this to say there are huge issues, and if we don't keep this out of our province, we're in big trouble. And the only way to keep it out of our province is to lock down our borders and to not have a boat or a piece of mud come into this jurisdiction without being decontaminated and inspected. So in BC, we have our surveillance program, which currently has about, or had about $3.5 million. DFO paid into it, the province paid the bulk, BC Hydro, Fortis, and the Columbia Basin Trust paid into it. Last year, DFO pulled out, BC Hydro cut its funding, Fortis cut its funding entirely, and Columbia Basin is still staying in there. So we had a program that only 1 in 4 boats were not getting inspected. We now have a program that has a shortfall of probably $1 million just for the monitoring that we have. So we need to get to a place where boats do not come into BC by law unless they've been inspected. And I can tell you what they do in the States, which is totally different than BC. If you take a boat across the northwestern states, you'll get pulled over by state patrol and they'll ask you if your boat's been inspected. And if it hasn't, you go to the next inspection station. And if you get it done in Montana, you go and you do it in Idaho and you do it in Washington. They take it very seriously. Here, there's no legislation. We are not following the rules. We do not have 24/7 inspection. So that is something that we need to move to rapidly. Because as I said, once you get these in this, you don't get that back. You don't ever turn the clock back on that. You have these forever, and then it's mitigation.
So how did the whirling disease end up in
Colorado was the first place. Probably came in either on boats or on people's, like it can literally come in on mud on a set of waders.
You said it was a worm?
So the host gets into a worm and then the worm gets into the fish. And it can live in the mud. So here's the scary thing is, the best solution that we have right now in parks is basically the idea is you go in and you rhodonone the lake, which means you kill all the fish off and you let it sit for hopefully decades until the parasite and the worm dies off and then you restock it. I mean, you're not doing that in the Kettle River. You're not doing that in the Okanagan Lake. You can rhodonone small water bodies. You can't rhodonone big water bodies. And so there's a whole bunch of pieces around, like in the States, they'll say no felt boots for waders. You got to clean your boots off everywhere you go. I mean, the biggest threat between these two is boats from other jurisdictions, for sure. Because they can live anywhere. They can live in the village, like anywhere. So on both fronts, the solution is actually the same, at least for now, is to make sure that you do not bring it into the province of BC. Okay, so let's talk about the good in the budget. Yeah, there's a good slide. We'll have a good slide. So, Together for Wildlife, when we came through the last time we talked about all the challenges with funding, we did get a $10 million uplift. Is it enough? No. Is it changing the needle? No. But we did get $10 million a year. The Watershed Security Fund is something that the Federation has worked on since 2013. The province endowed $100 million into that last year. It's going to be one of those funds where we can work on restoration. It needs to be $1 billion fund. We need the federal government to step into it so that we can actually live off of interest that's meaningful. But those are a couple of the good news pieces. It can't all be bad news every day. The other thing, there's a Wildlife Act review, which is good news. There was just $30 million announced for fire mitigation and prevention in the provincial budget. But I can tell you on the flip side of that, the losses just on my road, we had 13 neighbors. The losses are going to be more than $30 million just for our houses on our block. So it's good. Is it enough? No. And so I'll show you what this looks like in terms of the budget. Back in the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s, back when we had half the people in British Columbia, we used to spend 4 to 5% of our provincial budget on forests, land, air, water, fish, and wildlife. So 4 to 5% of the budget every single year went to taking care of what we all love. This year, it's going to be the lowest in history, BC's budget. Less than 1% of the budget is going to go into the ministries that are charged with taking care of everything that we care about. So the question naturally is going to be, are you okay with that?
I think the next question has to be, where are you gonna cut? We've not only so many dollars, right? The government clearly gives this the lowest possible priority, right?
Yeah.
So where are you gonna cut in order to get that number up?
Yep, that's a great question. We'll talk about solutions for sure.
Their wages. That would be a really good place to start.
So here's the other thing. So I'll just take you through all the lines of defense that we get when we talk to people, not even people, usually elected officials. It doesn't matter who the government is. This has been going on for years. Okay, well, it's healthcare and education that take up all the money. This is the challenge. Okay, well, let's look at the provincial budget. Here's the provincial budget in 1974, adjusted for inflation. So, in 1974, here's your spending. Here's your spending today. The line's going up all the time. More people, more wealth, bigger budget. Makes sense, right? We would probably expect that the budget that takes care of land, water, air, fish, and wildlife to go up as well, but it hasn't. It's completely flatlined. So the message there is it's everything other than the outdoors and nature and fish and wildlife that is getting a budget increase. It's not just healthcare and education, it's literally everything else. And then people ask, well, how does the spending compare to what we used to spend, relatively speaking, right? Because $1 is $1, and how does it compare to 4 years ago? Well, back in the early 80s, here's what we were spending when we adjusted for inflation. We've more than doubled the population. We know we've increased the threats. We know that fish and wildlife have declined. And guess what? We're spending at the same level we were 40 years ago. There's no way that you solve this equation with status quo funding that is the same as it was 40 years ago. Things go down. And the analogy here is, if we didn't fund healthcare and education, we'd have a whole bunch of people that couldn't get jobs and that died at a very young age. That's what Fish and Wildlife is experiencing in this province. And so then people say, what about fish and wildlife management? Well, this is from my graduate thesis from a few years ago. So the $10 million has not been included, but there's a whole bunch of metrics here. People say, well, we have fewer people in the States. We have different challenges. It's more important in other jurisdictions. So the bottom line here is that in BC, we have quite often more people than these other places. We have more species that we hunt. We have a smaller budget. We spend less per person and we spend less per square kilometer, by and large. Even in the Yukon, their budget for fish and wildlife management, $190 per person. We're spending $7. So if we start at the big end and talk about forest, land, air, water, we know that we're reducing funding. And when we look around and say, well, it's a problem everywhere, well, it's not. It's a problem in BC. Because everybody around us is spending more. So what do we need? What are the solutions? You're asking dedicated funding. That's the first one. That's what they have all over the United States. Even Alberta has it. We have the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, which is $5 or $6 million a year. But if we put all the hunting license in and we have it as a dedicated portion of the budget where projects related to taking money out of the environment go back into it, then we have a line of sight. And a lot of these challenges, you have a $60+ billion budget, you don't notice 100 million, to be frank. Rounding errors don't count unless any of you are watching your bank account and seeing pennies. Neither does the problem. You also need legislated objectives. So you need laws that say, here's what we have to do. Because we don't have those. We don't have objectives to say, how many deer do we want in the boundary? We have objectives to say, well, here's what the buck to doe ratio needs to be. Therefore, here's how we're going to manage hunting. But we don't have anything that says we need X thousand number of deer here, or we need to treat this many hectares of forest a year with controlled burns. And then independent decision making. You'll find all over the United States that they have fish and game commissions where they have people who are experts, and they either make the decision or they consider the decision and they put them up to the equivalent of the minister. This gets a lot of the political interference out of the way. That is one of the other pieces in this whole discussion that we need to really think about is, do you want political decisions all the time? And if you look over your shoulder, you probably don't. And then the other one that's really big right now is public access, right? You have a whole bunch of hunting regulations. I don't know if you've checked them out. It doesn't affect us down south, but up north, the word of the day is hunter densities. And we are taking a hard right turn as it relates to science-based wildlife management and moving into social management rapidly. As soon as you get into the business of social management, you do not get back to science, ever. So, why you're all here is because you have the power. It's not me. We can go into Victoria, talk to ministers, MLAs all the time. We can meet with MLA Russell. We can be there and we can tell them this is what's important to our members, but you're actually the people that have the strength. In a typical provincial election, it is won and lost by 60 to 80,000 votes. Typically. It bounces up and down, but that's the average. Between these people that fish in the freshwater and the saltwater, there is over closer to 600,000 licenses sold per year between those two. There's 110,000 people that buy hunting licenses in BC every year. So you blow the provincial election away if you're on the same page and if you're talking about it and if you're having club meetings and you're talking to members of the public about how important this is, you will have every party that says we want to give you money. They all will because they can't afford not to. You literally have the votes to control the outcome easily. Like this isn't even close. So that's the message from us to you is that we're in Victoria, we're constantly raising it, we're in the media all the time. But at the end of the day, where this gets decided is in October. And the more you all talk about it jointly in your community, in your newspapers, on social media, the more you're going to get every party saying, this is really important. If we don't make these people happy and take care of fish and wildlife, we're not going to get voted in. And by the way, these people don't even include the people that don't hunt fish. So in your family, if there's 4 people, you might not all hunt fish. But the other people are going to care about it, and there's British Columbians all over the province who care about these values, even if they don't hunt fish. So we are talking like a huge body of people that have the ability to control the outcome. And I'll leave you with this one. In a few areas around our property where the soil isn't completely nuked, there's some not willow. I can't even think of it right now. Anyways, it's having a hard time growing. Can't grow leaves because the deer are picking it off every single time it grows a leaf. And then there's some maple there. So the message around all this is there's hope. I mean, I have the same feelings as you every day that nobody's listening, that we can't change the outcome. But when I look at the numbers and I see people turn out in small communities like this, I know you can. I know you can convince your candidates to go to Victoria and convince their leader that they need to start funding it and they need to take care of it. Because if nothing else, if they're not doing it for all the right reasons, they're going to do it because of the votes. So thanks for coming out. Feel free to ask your questions or discussion. We're here to listen. But to us, you can totally do it. I figured you'd be up first. Go ahead.
Just Doug and I are stars on ice in an hour in Midway, so we have to go, but thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Let's Boogie Doug. Okay, Barry, sorry, past 6, so yeah, but we know what
Don't
you're
die anytime soon, Doug. We're running out of your guard.
I'll make it down the ice anyway.
Anyways, I moved to Grand Forks with my family in '78. I thought we had bought Cougar Jack Carson's guy here. He was a junior man, but I bought the business from Mary Mike Pitts, June 1, 1980. We had the animals.
after the 94 season, in good faith, we could no longer sell a mule deer hunt. After 2000, in good faith, we could no longer sell a white-tailed deer. And if you look, you were talking about the budget and how wildlife gets screwed. If you take the time today and just go through the paper that's out here, 2022. 22, British Columbia pre-season population estimates. 2022. The mule deer in British Columbia are 28,000 to 42,000 listed as stable. That's an in-your-face goddamn lie. White-tailed deer, 31,000 to 44,000 stable. If you run the numbers from 03, 011, 017, 022, they're the same estimates. 28,000 to 42,000 mule deer, 31 to 44,000 white-tailed. So this is really and this sentence right here defines the province probably most ruthlessly on this continent when it comes to wildlife management. Black-tailed deer, mule deer, white-tailed deer. These species are abundantly present within their natural range. And this is 2022. Given the abundance, estimates are mostly based on harvest numbers and do not indicate a conservation concern. That's the mother of all lies. Does anyone in this group not agree with that? Does anyone think we have these animals? No, we can go back in time and look at the numbers. Grand Forks Gazette, 1966. The great town in the Ontario accomplished 850 mule deer and 1,300 whitetail. That was Dave Spalding and Bob Shepard. Our conservation officer, we get game warden back then in the helicopters. Like we've got Al Peake. Al Peake did a count here in '86, connected to the Mi'kmaq sheep transplant. This is the old Overton Great 2 South Creek. For your interest, we conducted a deer count in February over the Gilbert property from lot 679 Overton Creek. Blah, blah, blah. We observed 962 deer. Using our siteability indexes, we estimated 960 mule deer, 1,100 white deer. Oh, that's 1986. Marty Thomas's last count, I think, was Marty 2020, counted 65 mule deer, and what was it? Something like 90 white. Well, we're steadily going down, and obviously, as you indicated on this budget, they're not going to spend any money on this. No.
Not unless we convince them to.
Political game in the box recently in the legislature was appointing Nathan Cullen is going to come up with a whole new vision on land management in our province. First Nations would be the dominant player. So there was a tremendous blowback, and I'm saying this because we've lost this wildlife resource, and you're not getting this back without the best of First Nation leadership. But then Nathan went in there, and the United Party, to their smarts, Ellis Ross spoke for First Nation leaders writing his scheme, and in the legislature, with all the screen reported by all of the newspapers, Ellis said, "We're in this together." And we're not. It's hard to bring people together. When you send letters, as I do, to non-consumptive people like Sierra Club to describe what's happening, it's tough to get people to support it. And you and I have had differences. You supported the white-tailed goat in an article in the Vancouver Sun going way back to April 10, 2010. ICBC won that fight.
So the question is how do we move forward? That's the question. And as you say, so on the hunter versus non-hunter side, we started a thing called the Fish Wildlife Habitat Coalition in 2020, and it has 28 member organizations from CPAWS, Y2Y, Guide Outfitters, Commercial Viewing, Angling Guides Association, BCWF, we literally represent, I think, like 400,000 or 500,000 people and over 1,000 businesses. So that's the question. So what I would say is everybody in our world right now is recognizing the same issue. It's not just hunters, it's also organizations who just care about wildlife and we're on the same page. So what you're saying, I'm not disagreeing with anything. I'm saying, how do we point the ship forward and how do we bring everybody in this room and all the people who you know that care about this to make it loud and clear to elected officials, to parties before this election that wildlife needs to be put first? That's the question.
Well, when you add all the parts of First Nations, the best of them are gonna leave us, so we're not gonna give you. They tend to unfund pretty slowly, but all the other stakeholders behind it, with the line, we have a constitutional right to hunt, and they're talking about us. You will touch the nerve in this wretched problem. That's the only.
Yeah, we work with First Nations all the time, but I'm not convinced the First Nations have enough votes to change the outcome, but I'm convinced that we do. So I think that's why right now is the time to start talking about it, getting people's attention, right? That's the trick is if all the parties think that you all are going to be voting on behalf of Fish and Wildlife, and you all are talking to candidates and MLAs about how important this is, it will change. It will change. Like, they don't have a choice. Before the last election, the last time we saw you, we had in 2016, every single party committed to dedicated funding, setting objectives. Dedicated funding still hasn't happened 7 years later. So this is your opportunity, because the last time every party said they would do it.
And that's a challenge with particularly politicians, is that they'll say anything to get elected. And then all of a sudden they have amnesia as soon as they get first past the post.
Yeah, I think it's our role to make it happen. Like, I mean, in my world, every day when I wake up, I know that no one else is going to do it for us. No one else is going to step up and say, this is really important to me. I want my kids to be able to go hunting and fishing. I want them to be able to see fish and wildlife. No one else is going to do that for you. So you got to do it for yourself. You got to do it as a team. Like, we have to do this together.
What's the mechanism for holding a particular, in this writing, say, holding that particular MLA accountable for what he said? Because there doesn't seem to be a way in the system that we have now. That's the big frustration that I think that most people have, is that there isn't a mechanism to say, hey, listen, you said this. When the hell are you going to do it?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is you get the opportunity every 4 years. The other piece that's being discussed in other clubs all across the province is like, they're ready to go rally in front of their MLA's office right now. They're ready to go to Victoria. Like, I'm hearing from them. I had a call from the Kootenays this morning, and they're planning on doing like a town hall or an all candidates forum in front of the government office before the election. Like, they're on it. Like, they are like seething right now. They are so mad with what's going on in the Kootenays. And so that's just, again, organizing people, getting them out there, getting people talking. That's it. And doing it on the same page. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we can all disagree on, but there's a few things that we all agree on.
If you get those rallies on the same day, all the media in the province will notice that, and so will the politicians. So,
Right.
If we get the funding, there's one thing I think most of us in this room would actually agree on, and that is that we need to get back to science. Currently, we manage wildlife in this province based on emotion. There's opinion, there's anecdotal evidence. We were asked to trust the science here a few years ago, remember, by our own government, but our government does not trust the science to manage wildlife. And there's also another government in this province that does not use science to manage wildlife. And they hold the golden wand, as you know, and it's getting longer, it seems. So how do we get back?
Yeah, and that's a structural issue. So, and when I did my thesis, like, we asked hunters, we literally asked moose hunters, like, what do you want to see? And they said unequivocally, we do not want politicians managing wildlife. Like, 100% unequivocally, like, hard science for social science. So again, that's a push on our end because they have it all across the United States. Like, they have fish and game commissions all over the United States. They have one in the Yukon. They have First Nations on it. So they're all doable. It's just a matter of, like, what do you really want? How do you ask for it? How do you make it happen? And that's it. to me. Like that's every day right now. I mean, you all are here for a reason, right? Like you're here because you care. And so what we're trying to say is you have an opportunity right now over the next 6 months and over the next year to drive serious change. Let's not lose it. Let's not lose this opportunity.
Just your position on the alternative praying hypothesis, which, kill the cow,
Yeah.
cat, moose, and suddenly there's going to be less wolf predation on small populations currently.
Okay, yeah, we can talk about caribou. So our position on caribou is that you need to manage predators and prey. That's our position. And it always was, is that you need to manage wolves.
You believe in that theory?
It's working.
Oh,
There weren't in old growth forests, there were not 1,600 moose in old growth forests 50 or 60 years ago. And it's working. Here's the irony of this situation. As it relates to caribou recovery, there's really 1 or 2 places in the province where we don't want a lot of moose. It's in caribou recovery areas, and guess where the only places in the province where moose are increasing?
Washington State tried that theory 1 year. Hammer the whitetail, we're going to get a big boost on the mule deer population. Now, this asinine idea that the best of the carnivore predator, the 4-legged predators, isn't going to figure out if he's in trouble, where to go or where he's going to have to go to discover. No, they did it 1 year, so we got another 16 states with mule deer whitetail population. It'll be a grind, and I'll bet when I connect with all of them, not a single one bought into that crap.
Yeah, and I mean, as it relates to what mule deer, your choices are burn trees, get rid of roads, reduce cougars, reduce whitetails. Those are your choices. So you can try all of them, you can try one of them. With caribou, what we've learned is you're better off pulling all of the levers and seeing what works than pulling one and limping it along, right? And so the world, I'll just speak right out as it relates to caribou recovery. The reason why there was wolf removal was because of the BC Wildlife Federation, because we went to the federal government in 2014. It wouldn't occur otherwise, and up north, it's occurring because the First Nations are on the same page. And as we talk about working with nations, I can tell you, grizzly bear hunting, licensed grizzly bear hunt, First Nations wants that. Just about across the entire province. So the synergies are there, 100%. The relationships are there. Again, it's politics. And I mean, again, hunting regulations, fishing regulations are not the BCWF's jam anymore, because we got rid of hunting seasons on caribou in the 1990s in the West Kootenays, and guess what they continued to do, right? We've got areas where there's little to no moose hunting, and moose are still declining. And like I said, the only place we don't want moose in this province right now, or lower densities, is in caribou recovery areas. And the only place where they're increasing is in caribou recovery areas. That's how backwards we have it.
Have you talked to John Rushnet?
Yep.
On this fight?
Yes. He used to be the
John
minister.
Rushnet do not like people not believing that kill them, cow and cat, white-tailed deer. Well, you didn't agree with that, Stephen.
He asked if I'd talked to him. We stick to science. Any other questions or comments or ideas?
What's the science on why the moose are increasing in caribou areas?
Yeah.
Do you know what's driving that?
Yeah, 2 things. Cut blocks and food, unlimited moose food north of Revelstoke. And the other one is we're managing wolves. Those are the 2 pieces. I should say the other place where moose are increasing is central Okanagan, the west side of Okanagan Lake.
Can we apply that in the declining areas or
Yeah.
and why is it not working?
We are in terms of caribou recovery or in terms of moose. We are not. Yeah, that's it. Wolf management and moose recovery go hand in hand, for sure. Habitat as well. Like there's lots of literature out of Alaska that shows you get big burns or landscape level management. It's really interesting because moose are not actually that hard to manage for. It's not that hard to make moose habitat as compared to some other species. We're just not trying. We're just not trying. Like restoring moose in places is really not that hard. I mean, you have a place like north of Revelstoke where you wouldn't have traditionally had moose. You log the heck of it. You don't have many predators. You end up with the highest density in the province. I mean, it's amazing, right? And like I said, the irony is, north of Revelstoke is not a place where we wanted more moose, and we had up to like 1,600 moose north of Revelstoke.
Mind you, I had the draw there last year, and we saw 1 cow.
Yeah.
And we were out there a lot.
You gotta talk to your guide. Not you. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I know, that's what I said, you gotta, yeah, he's the guy playing.
I think, Jess, you probably would help to explain that there's probably a lot of people in this room that don't know, or maybe you've never even heard of a parent competition, how that works. And the interesting thing that we found with our mule deer study is that the number one cause of death of mule deer is cougars, and the number one food of cougars is actually white-tailed deer. So I just think it's probably some people don't understand what a parent competition is.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so on top of the mule deer project, we also have a cougar project on the go, where we have a whole bunch of cougars collared in central Okanagan and even over in the Christian Valley too. And so a parent competition basically goes like this. On the landscape where you traditionally would have had mule deer, you would have had open forest, grasslands, you wouldn't have had a ton of whitetails. As forest encroachment goes, whitetails go up. When whitetails go up, cougars go up. Cougars do really well at killing mule deer in heavily forested areas. And so there's a bunch of research over the hill in the Boundary, where that's what they showed. And so what you can have is you can have white-tailed deer populations going up, cougar populations going up, and the cougars, just through incidents, same as with caribou, are running into mule deer and disproportionately killing them. The other piece with mule deer and whitetail is that whitetails bounce back. They're way more fecund, way more productive than mule deer. So like when we had the bad winter of 97 and 98, I think, 96, 97, whitetail deer bounced like in like 3 years over there. Like they increased dramatically, and mule deer do not have the birth rates to keep up with them. And so normally in a mule deer only system, you'd have a big winter die off, you'd have cougars crash after that, and then everybody would kind of go up together. In that case, cougars were held much higher because the whitetails bounced back so quickly. It gets really complicated, but the bottom line is a lot of this is, you know, there aren't that many people hunting cougars. Like the cougar harvest is down a lot compared to what it was in the Okanagan 30, 40 years ago, and even farther back when they were trying to get rid of cougars. But cougars and white-tailed deer go really well, and when you have really heavily forested environments like we do now, mule deer just get hammered. And it's the same with caribou. Even up north of Revelstoke, you only have a few hundred caribou, but we have cougars tipping over caribou north of Revelstoke just because there's more cougars on the landscape and because there's more wolves. It's not that they're like actively seeking them out, it's just through incidents they run into them. And then the last piece on this too is north of Revelstoke, you have more wolves on the landscape, and then you have snowmobiles on the landscape. In the wintertime, caribou's whole life is just to basically be where predators aren't. They just suck around predators. That's it. There's no other way to explain it. And in the wintertime, people are snowmobiling up in the alpine. The wolves hit the snowmobile tracks, go up to the alpine, and then they kill caribou. So that's how like the whole picture, and Rob can talk about this for hours. The collar data is there. Like it literally shows wolves going up to the alpine, and that country is a rainforest. So in the winter, there's more snow than the top of this. Like wolves normally would not have access to that habitat at all. So it's a very complicated relationship, and you can just try managing one species, which typically doesn't work. And what Rob's work shows is if you have levers, pull them all, pull them hard, and then readjust your strategy after that. Right? And I think that's a lot of the message is when you get down to a couple of handful of animals, if you do not get serious about it, it will cost you orders of more in magnitude in the long run than it does to keep them abundant.
Switching gears for a minute, you talked earlier, you showed pictures of your house, devastating. You talked about sort of two different types of fires, one that was far more catastrophic than the other, and I forget the names you gave them. So, like fire that burned your house down, of course, is clearly it's not the desired type of fire. So what the prescribed burns that you're talking about, when would they occur? How big would they be? That sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. So that's part of it. Is like, how do you like your smoke? And from our perspective, you know, you go in, you have a treatment, a prescription, you reduce the stems per hectare in a lot of these places. You burn in the spring and the fall when conditions are cooler, when you can control it and you can do it in a prescribed manner, and then it's manageable. If you just sit back and watch it, like it's not just Kelowna, it's everywhere. Like I can tell you, like this place is not immune to the fire that went through West Kelowna last year. Absolutely not. It's going to cost a lot of money, but the cool part is it's great for wildlife. I mean, we build houses on winter range all the time, but what winter range we have left really isn't very high quality. And even Chloe's deer movement, like The deer are selecting open slopes a lot. Like they like that. Mule deer like to be in open places where they can see their predators. That's part of how they evolve. That's part of their ecology. And whitetails are the exact opposite, right? They evolved like 2.5 million years ago. They love like the thickest forests. Like Florida is their thing, right? They want to be in thick forests where they can run away. They know every single trail. Whereas mule deer, sheep, goats, they want to be able to see what's coming at them. So again, you can do it in the spring and the fall where you go in, you reduce the stems in the forest, you get rid of a lot of that fuel, you put controlled fire on the landscape. You can do that, or you can just sit back and watch. And I mean, with the way the snowpack is this year, like we're headed for a repeat right now. Like we put it out. I literally did an interview 2 days before our house burnt down because that was the 20-year firestorm from Kelowna in 2003. It was literally 20 years, I think, plus 2 days that our house burned down.
So first of all, sorry about your house. No, really. That's second, those stand conditions are created by land management decisions,
Yes.
right?
100%.
And what I've seen is a lot of sort of this wildfire mitigation stuff. It's very expensive. And I think we budgeted, whatever, $7.9 billion deficit. I mean, right now it's top of mind and we'll spend money on it, but when people can't go to the hospital because there's not enough hospitals, that funding will disappear. And so I guess I would argue for sort of like with forestry, that area that you live in likely was like there's visual quality objectives, a lot of regulatory things that stop, say, logging to a certain, we could log those stands to a much more natural state, but there's a lot of opposition to that. Like you talk about science and wildlife versus politics, it's the same with forest management, right? And we could doing a lot of that and actually generating revenue for the Crown instead of the Crown spending $20,000 a hectare. That's insane.
Yeah.
When we can be generating fiber and doing the same thing. So why are we not doing that, I guess?
Yeah, that's yeah. So the question is, why are we not doing it? And the answer is, that's a great question. I don't have an answer. I mean, we've been pounding on this door for years, and like we've even brought up, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be happy. Like there are provincial parks that need this. Like there is no way to get around reducing the stems per hectare and the fuel load in provincial parks without logging it. Like there's not. And so there are ways
on snowpack, not after it's burned.
Right. Yeah.
You know, there's lots of things we can do. And
Yes.
I'm part of the forest industry, obviously, so I'm advocating it for some extent. But it's a very difficult machine to change the dial on. And it's like we did one prescribed burn. It took me weeks. And the guy I worked with from the Forest Service, it took us weeks of trying to convince my organization, the organization, the local watershed committee. It's a lot of work. But if there is a sort of leadership on it from guys like you, Roly, that it's a lot of work to explain to the public rationally. Our public is influenced more by Facebook posts than they are by. It gets very difficult to explain this stuff.
Yeah.
Like your description of NDT4. Well, what about NDT3, which is like frequent stand replacing fires every 80 years, where we've logged for the last 80 years. Those things burned like 300,000 hectares like that.
Yeah.
And that's a natural part of the environment too. So we can't just be trying to manage one forest type or 8 different forest types one way. That doesn't work either.
Yeah, and even as it relates to NDT3, there's a bunch of research going on in the caribou, and they're finding like intervals of less than 30 years.
Yeah.
So the whole, like, even that is like, that science is getting old rapidly, but what you're saying is entirely correct. And so the other piece around forestry and post cut block management that we've talked about intensively is used to do broadcast burns and cut blocks all over the province, and the province transferred liability over to licensees, and now it's really hard to get them. And like doing a broadcast burn in a cut block after it's been logged is great for wildlife. It brings in a whole bunch of veg. It's good for logging in the long run because trees grow faster. Like there's a whole bunch of benefits. It's really a matter of convincing the province to get on board. And we're on the same page.
We're on committees saying where we're trying to how do we get more burning? Well, It's very easy. Just all we need is the funding for it, and there's mechanisms in the stumpage system where we could basically get that cost recovered. But yet we're sitting around 5 years later going, "Wow, geez, I don't know how why."
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
We need leadership, Roly.
It's when you get down to it, it's a political will issue. And again, that's what this room is about. Like that's what you all are about. Is like there's solutions out here. it takes political will. So I'll talk about the latest change to the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship. So we got pulled into a meeting with the Premier like a couple of weeks after our house burned, and like they changed that ministry in like 4 days. Like literally we went in there and it's like, this system is broken. My house just burned down in a place where we tried to do a controlled burn. This didn't have to happen. Here are all the problems that we've run into. And they literally changed it in like a handful of days. So it's political will. And that's what this room, I mean, you can all have so much power you don't even know it. Like if it becomes a priority of the government, it happens. If it's not, if we're still talking about it, it doesn't happen. And like in our case, a bunch of these burns that we're doing, it's all with First Nations. And it's working very well, the relationship. And quite frankly, like a lot of it is on federal land now that we're working on, because we've had so many challenges with the province to get prescribed, controlled, cultural burns up and running, that we're moving on to federal land, because then we don't have to go through all the steps and consult every single person on the face of the earth.
So is there not anybody in provincial government that is willing to even look at and consider the science that you bring to it and say, hey, look, this is what we've got. Here's the studies, here's the things. Like, so it's not based on science at all. Is that what you're saying? Because we understand that there's probably not a lot, certainly in wildlife management, but apparently not even science involved in forestry either then.
There is, but it's very slow. It's very cumbersome, and it's
Well, most bureaucracies are
it's expensive.
astonishingly slow.
Yeah.
I can answer that question when
Sure.
chance.
Okay. And I don't have to talk. Yeah, you're sharing it. I can take a break anytime.
Any more questions?
I did have a question. So we don't have to go down a huge presentation about CWD, but I think a few people in the room wanted to discuss that. There is a great webinar that we put up on our Facebook page that Kate Nelson did this last week that is like just a nice overview. But funding is lacking in that department too, and that has to do with the losing our testing facility in Abbotsford.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I didn't put it in because we could go down 5 million rabbit holes today. So CWD, everybody's aware. Bottom line, again, you get it, you don't get rid of it. Your only solution is try to mitigate its spread, and that involves going in and literally where you have positives, reducing deer populations so it doesn't move around. Like that's it. That's what you got. And we are still getting test results in right now. People that harvested deer in October. Montana, I think the turnaround is like a matter of days. Colorado too.
But
That's a funding issue. Like
something like bounty feeding or salt licks and those kind of things? Because
that's all coming.
They're cam, right? And
yeah, so here's again the challenge is hunters will bear the disproportionate brunt of this, 100%. And so all the things that happen after this are like trappers, you can't move a carcass, it's got to be tested, it can go into your freezer, you can't distribute it until afterwards. Hunters, we want you to leave as much in the bush. We don't want you dumping your, the spine and stuff in the bush. You need to double bag it, take it to dump. Well, the dumps don't take wild animal products. Like there's a whole bunch of pieces. Baiting's going to be a part of the discussion. Salt licks are going to be a part of the discussion. But quite frankly, like town deer are one of the biggest vectors in the province, and why we have 300 deer in Cranbrook is beyond my level of comprehension. That's another political will issue, right? So for CWD, our problem again, we got like $210,000 to limp along a program for the single biggest threat to wildlife in this entire province. Like, it's not on the radar. The testing facility we're using is at the University of Saskatchewan. We are now 4 months later, we still don't have test results. There's no way you can manage this. So it's like having a person come in who's terminal and saying, we'll put you on the waiting list and you might find out in 4 to 6 months. You just can't do that. You can't.
The guys, they've been doing CWD testing in Alberta for a long time and they still wait similar amount of time there too. So
yeah,
we're not special.
Alberta is a really interesting case study because when you talk to the Alberta biologists and the scientists in Alberta, they will say Alberta completely dropped the ball on that. And what they're telling us is you're in a good position because you only have 2 positives. We waited till we had them. We had it everywhere. South Saskatchewan is something like 70% prevalence rate in mule deer because everybody stood around and didn't act. They said, you're still in a good spot, but you better get on it right away. I mean, and Alberta's program, like they have university researchers working on it. We tried to get some university funding. That's a whole other story, but the money is not there. And it's like single biggest threat to wildlife. There should be millions of dollars opening. We should have our own testing station. We should have a plan. We should be reducing densities. We should be monitoring deer populations, dealing with these town deer. Here we are, right? I can't even, I'm on an NDA. I can't talk about it anymore, but it's frustrating.
Any more questions?
One question. Jesse, you're familiar with Andrew Weaver's report, study January 25th, 2018. Before it's too late, British Columbia needs a science and ecosystem-based approach to wildlife management. You're familiar with it.
100%.
Wouldn't that in of itself imply conservative hunting regulations, not what that you promote?
Yeah. So, I didn't put it in the slide either. We can talk about mule deer right away. So one of the biggest things, and you were there, right, Brad? Like hunting regulations have always been a hot topic. So it's like that was the first thing we wanted to look at in the mule deer study. It's like, is this a problem? Is this creating declines? So the first thing you do is you go, we need to find out if everybody's pregnant. Because if they're not pregnant or not pregnant on time, then the whole system comes unraveled. We got ultrasounds out. We went and caught a ton of deer. I think we had one doe in all of the study areas that wasn't pregnant. And we had twinning rates that are higher than Colorado, Idaho, California. So everybody's pregnant. Just about everybody's carrying twins. And guess what? Deer are going down. So what does that mean? Deer aren't surviving. We know that we're not shooting does and fawns, but we're not having a population increase. So that tends to indicate that hunting is not what's causing these declines. So we tested that right out of the gates. That was one of our first things. And Brad, you might have a different experience, but when we looked at it, it's like, I wanted to address it right away because hunting regulations were always the talk. It's like, are these does pregnant? Because when we did it in December and January, if they were having to carry through a second estrus, you wouldn't be able to see the fetus. So what we found out, and when we do the collars in the spring to see when they slow down when they're having babies, everybody's clustering at the same time. So that to us was like, okay, hunting's not the cause. It's survival because everybody's pregnant. Everybody is packing twins. It's just that we're not getting anybody to survive long enough to actually see a population increase. And if you have,
We run a coalition of all British Columbians and and I do my best to educate them that this hunting opportunity game that you promoted yesterday. And remember, one of your better presidents, BC Wildlife president, no longer with us, Carmen Pert, to one of the meetings of past presidents said politely to them, "You're on the wrong note." In other words, there's a message here. Have you read Aldo Leopold's book? Well, you know, like I do, page 167. The continuous census is the hallmark of conservation. And of course, that's, ministry, it's not true. Well, we got one thing in common.
Oh, the only thing I was gonna say about CWD, if you think there's only 2 positive cases, you're joking.
Yeah.
We only tested 58 deaths in Region 8, so.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more coming.
yeah, and this is the other part of the challenge is like when your sample size is small, your likelihood of detection. And so again, the background on this, one deer was down by the border, it was a muley buck. The other deer was near Cranbrook, it was a white-tailed doe. So we've got 2 different species. They're relatively long distance apart. We already know that those deer and elk in those areas will travel all the way out towards the Bull River, out towards the Elk Valley, out towards Mount Broadwood. We know that there's deer that go in the other direction up towards Grey Creek and over to the West Kootenays. So we could totally be in a position where we are so far behind we think we're first right now. We could.
So Jesse, when do we stop eradicating whitetails? Because we're still losing, we've been nuked whitetails since 2011. So when are we gonna stop? Because it ain't working for the mule deer.
Yeah, so the whitetail question,
There's
yeah.
nothing left.
Yeah, so the whitetail question, I'm leaving that to Sam. That's part of his PhD, which is supposed to be done next year. That's part of his job is to help understand what's on the landscape and how that is impacting mule deer. That's part of his job, and we're actually looking for a postdoc now to take all of Chloe's collar and movement data and all of Sam's camera data and put them together and help us understand, because like our deer in the Bonaparte seem to be doing, relatively speaking, much better, and it's a totally different ecosystem there. So that's what we're looking for. it's like, Sam, what do you got? And then how do we put this whole package together? Adam's also applied for collars for whitetails to look at what's going on. So we're not ruling anything out at all. And I can tell you, like, anecdotally in the Kootenays, where they have heavily liberalized cougar harvest and whitetail, like, the indications are that mule deer are on the increase over there. I don't know, but I guess I feel like where we're all going to agree is if we have a properly funded Fish and Wildlife Management Agency and we knew what our populations were, like even what Senior's saying about the mule deer estimate, it's an estimate, it's habitat based. In the United States, in Idaho, if you're putting out 400 collars a year, you know exactly what's going on in that population. Like, we don't even have a way to census mule deer in British Columbia. We have a model to go out and census moose where we can estimate them. We have no model to census mule deer in British Columbia. Doesn't exist. We don't have it.
And you're hoping that harvest surveys that hunters fill out, people actually do them.
It's the best data we have, right? So again, a lot of this comes down to, like, we can disagree on these small things, but we can all agree that if we had a proper Fish and Wildlife Management Agency,
Amen.
the world would be a lot brighter place for all of us. Because I don't like talking about regulations either.
I know that Region 8 wants 300 samples a year to be confident the CWD's not right here in our backyard. We even implemented a rule as a club that if you want your horn scored at next year's horn scoring, you will be putting that in a freezer or we will not be scoring it. And a lot of other clubs like that rule that we brought in.
Awesome.
This is pretty serious, and like Jesse said, when it's here, we're not getting rid of it, so.
We don't wanna get to where Saskatchewan is, because I've seen the results of their tests, and I'll bet you every 10 years coming back positive.
65% of the deer in Alberta are tested positive, of the ones that are being tested. Why is it too that the First Nations don't have to get theirs tested?
So tobacco, like, the Chinaha are, like, they have their own drop-off locations, like, and
It's not mandatory.
No, and also ONA called me and they want to set up their own facilities, so they're on board. Like, they actually want to develop lab capacity and everything, so it's not mandatory, because they're not licensed hunters. That would be why.
Yeah.
But ONA reached out right away and they're like, where do we put up deep freezers? How do we support this? How do we include our communities? So,
They'll probably get funded for a lab long before we would.
They will. It'll be put on the reservation next week and up and running. We'll done.
As long as we can all use it, right?
That's right.
yeah, no, their ONA has been really good on, like, super collaborative. So I think I'm done. No, I'm not.
I just figured I got to say something.
Yeah.
Don't even know what I'm gonna say, but one thing you mentioned early on was decades. Just decades of arguing and fighting and livid wanting to kill people and just all kinds of shit. Everything just slowly getting worse and worse and worse with the population, road access, and fire suppression, and it's just getting to this big head, and it's great here we're gonna work together, well, with all our differences and so forth and so on. It is the only way moving forward, and that will include First Nations. We all have to come together somehow.
Yeah.
Good luck, it's not gonna be easy, that's for damn sure, but gotta keep fighting, I guess is the point. I mean, as frustrated as you get, it's easy to say, piss on it, but you gotta keep going. So at least we're in a room, and wherever we go, we're gonna go, we won't get any worse, put it that way. We're just about extinct of everything now.
Well, Barry's right. There's only 50 of us here today, but if you go and talk to all your friends that didn't make it today and everything to get the word spread, everybody has to work together. We have to work with First Nations, that's the way it is. They have to work with us.
No, they don't.
Well, they don't have to, but they should. But we all need to work together. That's the bottom line, and we're all in this for the long haul, as long as we're around.
We're all getting pretty gray though.
We are, you know.
James is the youngest one.
Okay, anyways, we were hoping that some more candidates that were running for MLA in this election would be here today. Unfortunately, the Conservative guy passed away in a tragic car accident in January, and the United Party guy is at a conference. But we're lucky enough to have our current MLA, Roly Russell, here that would like to answer some questions for you and have a little chat. Okay, maybe we'll take a quick break then.
I'm happy to go right away, but I know you've all been said. If people want to grab a coffee, later when I start. Yeah.
Coffee water.
What do you want to do? You want to take 5?
You want to take 5? It's up to you guys.
All the old guys gotta go pee.
Okay, sounds like we're taking 5.
So yeah, thank you all for being here.
Hey,
So I want to start just now. We were just talking past president and current president. Congratulations, Jesse. We're just a little conversation about the toll that the kind of work that these guys are doing takes on the family life, and so my hands up to the leadership here, and I know there's a bunch of other board members in the room, and there's a lot of people that are putting a lot of energy into this work, and it takes it exacts a very real cost on all of our own lives. So thank you guys for what you do. Thanks for the people behind the scenes that are helping make it happen. Jeff also mentioned Daryl. So Daryl was my conservative counterpart in the last election, and he was going to be my conservative opponent in this election. Daryl was awesome. I assume that this room, there's some of you that would have known him, and I had coffee with him a couple months ago, just before the extension. He was great. We had the most fun on the campaign trail together, because to be honest, we saw kind of eye on a bunch of stuff, and we would hang out. He was the one that was always ready to go wherever, so I'd be like, hey, Daryl, let's go do this thing. And so I really genuinely disappointed that he's gone, because he was a really good guy. So hands up to him. I had some idea about what I was going to talk about, and I really cared. That all changed, and so then I had another listen to Jesse. I was like, okay, I got to talk about a bunch of other things. So I was saying to Alyssa, yesterday I just got back from Victoria. You guys can all hear me okay? Yeah. I got back from Victoria yesterday, and I was ready to quit, because I was like, okay, this work takes so much energy, and it is so hard to get action on what we're trying to get action. I got elected on the idea. I was coming into this in terms of the emergency management space. That was what I was familiar with. That was what I was frustrated with provincial government, and forest management, because I was frustrated with how slow the change was. And it's hard, right? It's hard, as these guys know, as Jesse knows, to actually make that change. And there's a bunch of things that have already been said that I have a hard time not taking the bait when people say things. So I would love to talk to you more about your challenge to politicians. That's fine. Politics, partisan politics, 100%. Open it up. Let's take the shots at it. But comments about promises that I've made that I haven't kept. Well, let's talk about it after, because I don't know anything that I've said that I haven't actually been working passionately to try to deliver. And so I again, this distinction, we're getting into a really ugly season of politics, right? And as we get closer and closer to elections, I don't think anybody likes it. But the opportunity here, as Jesse's saying, is the opportunity is to make sure our voices are heard and actually get stuff done. This is the time to actually really hammer away on it. I would say to a number of these pieces, so Barry made the comment about the ecosystem, I'm not that familiar with Andrew Weaver's report, but ecosystem health and that premise. So some of that work that we do is changing the narrative. Some of that work that we do is changing the narrative for Victoria. And so things like you mentioned the shift in the ministry, this creation of a new ministry around water, lands, and natural resource stewardship. That was an enormous freaking amount of work to get us there. And that is so that the voices of people in this room are getting heard, and we're not this element under a bunch of other work that is taking place. So those kinds of changes change the narrative. You would have seen, hopefully, and if you haven't, I encourage you to have a look, a framework that came out of that ministry around ecosystem health and biodiversity management. And Barry, we can, as we all have history with Barry, so I'm happy to, I know you well enough, I feel like I can challenge you on that. Your question, I think, was to say that this framework, and again, I don't know that legal framework, but the framework around ecosystem health is going to restrict hunting opportunities going forward. And I would entirely challenge that premise. And I would say the conversation in this room around how are we managing to the science is about we want healthy ecosystems. So when we're talking about how we're managing our forests, we need to figure out how to make sure we're managing our forests for all the values that we care about. And it's not just how many cubic meters of fiber coming out of that forest. It is, what are all these other things we care about? It may employ us, it may keep us, keep food on our tables. That matters to us. But it also matters to us that we have the animals out there to hunt. It also matters in terms of we have the opportunities out there to go do the things we want to do in an environment that we care about that's healthy, right? So I encourage you to in this space, like we're talking, like Jesse said, okay, so I was going to come in, I was going to talk about CWD and a bunch of that stuff. I appreciate, the comment that Jesse made, okay, dollar invested in, I think that was around quagga and zebra mussels, maybe, right? $1 on your hydro bill today probably offsets $10 in the future in terms of the cost of management. Those are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. That's why, as somebody said earlier, like, we're getting a lot of challenge right now in terms of this budget because we're running a deficit. Well, these are the sorts of things that we need to invest in because the cost of not doing it today is enormous in the future. And so there are these elements there that we need to be getting together and figuring out how to advocate for. I read an article this morning, for example, I see the friction between the Indigenous nations and some of the people in this room. I read an article yesterday, it was this morning, came up yesterday around cherry producers in the Okanagan, and it was Dixon Trebasket. I don't know if he's still with the ONA, but so he's advocating for elk corridors, right? Like, so the issue I would say that this room, you have to make sure you get on board with is figuring out how do we align. Like, if it's a fight, it's going to be harder and harder to win. And if you can figure out how to collaborate and ask for those things together, then it's going to be easier and easier to win. And so, as Jesse said, okay, talking about the population here, talking about all the fishing and hunting licenses around the province. Okay, there was a little infographic that I saw recently too. It was the population of BC, right? And it was divided into thirds, and the one third is like downtown Vancouver and not far beyond that. The next third is basically lower mainland-ish area, the south end of the island. And the other third of the province is the rest of us. And so if you take an adversarial approach to getting this stuff done, then it doesn't matter which party it is. If they're paying attention only to votes, I hate the partisan politics. This is the reality. Like, if they're paying only attention to votes, then if you're advocating for something that those other 2/3 of the province don't want, it's going to be very, very difficult. And so on this conversation, for example, part of the work that I have been doing relentlessly in Victoria is trying to change this narrative around, for example, environment versus jobs, because it's bullshit and it doesn't get us anywhere. And if that's the narrative that we're advocating for, we're going to lose in rural BC, right? We're going to lose in rural BC because we will see that the people that do not have the connection to land, that do not have the connection to place, outnumber us. Right? That's the reality. So the thing that I would say here to this group, which is not either of the first two iterations of what I want to share with you, is that if we don't figure out how to work on this stuff together and do it in a way that gets the attention of the partisan machinery, I don't care which party we're talking about, then it's not going to work for us, right? So my role in Victoria, after I got elected, the premier calls everybody and says, "Hey, okay, well, what are you interested in? What do you want to do?" Right? And my response to that was, "This is a new gig for me. I don't know. I need to learn how to do the job, but I need to see that our government does something different for rural BC." Right? We need to build a different structure for rural BC. And this is, again, it's not a partisan statement. It's, we talk about how hard it is to change the forest industry. That's not necessarily a limitation of political will even. It is a challenge in terms of the inertia of that, the provincial government, right? We talk about science-based decision-making. Well, I came out of the world of science. Science doesn't tell us what to do. It tells us what's going to happen when we make a decision. And so politics, the political machinery, that thing that is not ever going to go away in Victoria, has to take the science and overlay the values and make a decision. And so the challenge is figuring how do we do that in a way that works for us, particularly in rural BC. And so that is what I've now had the opportunity of doing in Victoria and around this province for the last however many years, 3 years. And I love that work, but it is challenging work because as soon as we get into this really adversarial perspective, we all lose. And so anyway, that's the piece, I guess, not what I was planning to talk about, but I think that this room, it's important to think about that. If we want to move forward, we need to figure out how we're going to do that. And again, it's like this is the conversation that, these are the kinds of conversations that we have with Jero if he were here, right? It's not a party issue. Is it how do we actually get the change that we want to see in our communities? I have a bunch of other stuff I was going to say, but I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to. We're in Victoria for the next 3 months. I think basically it's really hard. Like right now, it's I get home for 36 hours sort of thing to see my family. After this, it's easy to have I'm happy to have another conversation like this. We can come back here, we can have a longer time and dig into it. I like these. This is the work that I like. The Victoria work is not very satisfying. It is constantly pushing to get things done. They're always difficult to see translated in action. To wear the political hat for a little bit, I feel like we've got a lot done that doesn't get a lot of airtime. So things like that ecosystem health framework, to me, that really matters, right? But you all have to have a look, you have to engage on it. So the issues around how we're managing our forests and the paradigm shift in our forests to say, okay, we need to value more than just this economic output that is not jobs. It is economic output for industry, and recognize we have a bunch of other values. Those changes are really, really significant. So we're getting some of those things done, and I'm frankly, I'm proud of it. I think that's important work to do. Again, I would end, I guess, with the comment Jesse had towards the end of his comment, was just like, the people have the power to do these things, right? But that is the whole province. So you all have the power, it's you drive the outcomes. But we have to figure out how we want to make sure we're doing that in the right way. And I'm happy to have Q&A, and so I will see.
Please raise your hand if you have any questions. Brent?
The land use management amendment that we're all welcome to comment on, if you're familiar with the website and for any resident that can go to submit comments on that, you're familiar with it? Do you remember, because I didn't write them down and I don't remember, there were 6 questions.
I do not have the questions, but I'm happy to share them. And I'm glad you reminded me, because that was one thing that Minister Conroy, we were just talking to her yesterday, and she's like, oh, sure, you mentioned the engagement on that piece again, because we need to hear it, and the voices of this room matter, but you have to put that feedback in. It's a little bit of a process. You have to.
Okay, good. I'll just let me finish, please. Just those 6 questions. It sounds like you kind of have an idea, if you don't remember them verbatim. Where do we find the answers to those questions? Because on the website, it's to invoke thought in us, but we need the answers to those 6 questions. Where do we find those, or do you know what the answers are?
We're asking you for your answers.
We can't get those answers.
What do you mean? I don't understand.
Do you remember what the 6 questions are? I wish I wrote them down. Can you get it on there?
Here, what legislation? Are you talking about the hunting regulations?
No, the land use management amendments.
So Land Act, you're
The
talking.
Land Act amendment.
Okay, so this is the part that I was coming, thinking that I was going to speak to, was the land economic, and I would like, and this again is stuff that, do you have the what was it?
I wish I wrote them down.
So no, I don't have the answers to those questions. But what I was gonna come talk about is, in large part, the danger of misinformation. And so on the Land Act, right? So we've pulled that back, right? So I don't know if you heard, but so that the Land Act piece, which was moving forward, was gonna move forward this legislative session. Again, the people were obviously concerned, frustrated, and so we put that on hold to make sure we do that in a good way, right?
Yes.
And I, I certainly was an advocate for that because I feel like we need to do that. But I also encourage you to look at what the reality of that act was. And I think this stuff is great, right? So you have a document here, which is your key messages for election 2024. And on the whole, I'm like, I see. But in here, for example, you say, on the Land Act, the amendments under consideration will profoundly affect the ability of British Columbians to steward, access, and enjoy nearly every inch of the province for recreation and business. And so, if you're going to have key messages for the election, please make sure they're right, and that isn't right. Okay, so again, and I can provide you, I can provide the association with the details of what those amendments actually were. But that is a message that is part of that. Again, we're getting close to an election. We're full of all this we have the partisan machinery that is trying to change the outcome of the conversations, right? That's the outcome of that machinery in my mind, because that's not right. And if you look at the actual reality of what that Land Act amendment was about, it's about, so for example, the changes that were proposed in the Land Act were changes that they're already, for example, included in similar way in, for example, our environmental assessment process. Okay, so that environmental assessment process is the avenue through which, like a mine, you're going to develop a mine. That's what you have to go through. You go through the environmental assessment office, and that process exists. The one example we have or one of the examples we have would be looking at the development of a mine in the northwest, the Tall Tan mine up there. That utilized the new kind of version of what that engagement looks like. So that meant that's an investment of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. It is bringing First Nations to the table to work with industry and with government at the front end of the process so that everything is a little more predictable for all of those players going forward. Those are the kinds of changes that come about there. The Land Act amendments had zero impact, I would say, to anybody in this room. They were not about hunting regulations. They're not about hunting rights. They're not about trap lines. They wouldn't impact any of those things. And yet that was the frenzy that was whipped up. And the danger there, I would say, is that ends up fueling, in this case, that ended up fueling a lot of increase in racism and nastiness. And that then erodes the group's ability in this room to make change. Because if you drink that Kool-Aid and you go down that path of saying it is an us versus them conversation, then this room is going to be the ones that fall back on that. So sorry for the long answer.
No, that's a great answer. And I understand the service diagram actually is pretty transparent on the website, that it actually changed, not necessarily who was involved in the decision-making process, but the order in which, that's me. Right. And I didn't see anything there that looked invasive on the front to fish and wildlife management at all. But land management is a big deal to all of us. So that's why I asked. But it's the 6 questions there that I thought was interesting that were all 6 of the most important questions that I would love to hear the answers to, but you can't find them anywhere, and I can't get them unless I get them from you or you and the other government.
Okay, I'm happy to look into that a little more, and we can talk about it, because I don't have that front of mind, but we can follow up on that. And again, to the point, I feel like part of this discussion is about part of the bigger picture discussion. It gets framed as this like big government versus little government scenario. Certainly for me and for the communities in rural BC, I don't think it's a big versus little debate. It's about how to invest in getting more input and decision making on the ground in community. That doesn't necessarily directly tie to that big versus little government piece, but it is things like landscape level management. So say, okay, if we're working on forests, we gotta make sure that everybody's working together and actually having the conversations about what's going on. It means investments in watershed security fund, right? So like Jesse mentioned, that $100 million investment in watershed security fund, that's another huge win to me. And it's the sort of stuff that I've been fighting for in this room. You know, years ago, we were talking about how do we bring together a group of people for the Kettle River watershed so that we have agriculturalists, we have industry, we have forestry, we have all of the players in this room, including First Nations, to say, what do we want to see in our watershed? And then let's fight for that. And if everybody on the ground is on the same page, let's make sure the government understands what we want to see. So that, and those sorts of changes are what we're trying to support through Watershed Security Fund. That's why that's so important. It's because it's making sure that the input is on the ground so that, you know, maybe for those of you that are farmers, you know, maybe we delay the onset of level 4 drought by 2 weeks. And that could make a world of difference because of local input in the process.
I guess, Roly, I think probably the land act amendments bring up probably more of a touchstone issue with people generally, and that's with the DRIPA and how it's affecting resource extraction to a large extent, which a lot of us are employed by. And, you know, I mean, the writing on the wall in terms of wildlife allocation, those kind of things, that is going to happen. And so I have to be kind of careful because it's proprietary to some extent, but when we're out looking at a cut block, say proposed cut block, and we're discussing various scenarios, what we're going to cut out. Now, when it comes down to it, where we have a disagreement, and that elder says, look, free, prior, and informed consent. We say no, this isn't going to happen, because we know if we go to court, we're going to win. And he's right, right? Goes to the Supreme Court eventually, something like that. So if we're, say, reducing our annual cut based on input from First Nations, which is fine, then, and yet at the end of that 5-year cut period, you didn't harvest your volume. So guess where that volume goes? Well, probably First Nations, because that's the appetite of government right now, probably in general. Most of them based in Vancouver that aren't affected by the fact that maybe we don't have access to fiber to fire equipment at that mill, right? But I guess, so it's a fear, and it's not necessarily an unjustified fear that there's a whole other level of government of people that have never been here, or at least not in the last 100 years, that are having input on our lives, big impact. And so that generates, in my opinion, a backlash that probably is not helpful. Like, true reconciliation doesn't involve a meeting of people that don't live here in the boardroom with the provincial government, with us getting, okay, now it's your turn, after all these decisions get made without our input. So that pisses us off, I think, generally. And I don't think it's going to work out well for the whole reconciliation movement. So I don't know how you address that, but I feel like it's a real fear that's not it's not racism. It's just it's fear based on people losing their livelihood potentially.
Yeah, 100%. And I would agree, right? And I would distinguish between that fear or concern or uncertainty about the future versus the racist views, right? But there's both of those things out there mixed all together. And that's where I would say what you're describing is a good start to a conversation, right? It as soon as it spills over into the other side of things, it is a stop to that conversation, right? So the way you're describing, absolutely. I think, you know, this, I don't know what words you said just now, but something about like, this is a difficult situation. I said there's a lot of those in my world right now in terms of like, how do we actually figure out the path forward? I would say in that space, to me, it is what you're describing. We know we're going to lose those court cases, right? So this is part of the challenge is we've ended up in this very litigious world where it's like, okay, well, we're going to sue you if this happens and you're going to sue us if this happens. And Jesse mentioned, you know, like kind of devolving liability away from, you know, whoever you are or what organization you are. I think that's part of how we've got to this place is we're all trying to avoid that space. And again, that's where, you know, my plea, I would say, is figure out how to work together because without that, we're just spiraling down this path of making everything more and more difficult, making everything more uncertain for all of us. It doesn't matter, frankly, like what you do or where you're employed. those of us in rural communities, like everybody's tied to the natural resource sector, right? The other thing I was going to talk about was like the work to figure out what's the future of our natural resource sector and how do we do that in a way that means that, I know that my kids, they can have a job in the forest sector if they want to in 20 years, right? So I hear you, I agree with you. I think that's a good frame for it. I think the challenge is how do we move away from that very litigation focused kind of model of going forward, because we've seen that proven over and over again around the world. It makes things worse. It doesn't actually get us in a better place. And that's partly what we're trying to do in terms of even like the emergency management legislation, massive piece of legislation, right? Working with nations to try to do that and get to a point where we're all on the same page is a lot of extra work. It's hard to do. And so we get there, but it's not easy. Same like the Toltan example I gave you with that mine. That basically means the front end of that process is slower, right? It takes more to have more time to get more people at the table. But it means after the permit's been issued by the provincial government, that industry player isn't sitting there in risk of litigation every step of the way because the nation is saying, no, we don't want this, and no, we don't want this. It means everybody is coming together, put more energy in the front end to get to federal. So I hear you, it's not easy, but those are it's underlined.
I guess what I find kind of upsetting, and I think it actually creates tension, is that there's this government to government thing where we don't get to hear about it. So that creates distrust immediately. When someone in Ostudias is talking about, well, they've on a piece of land they've never been to in their lives, and I've spent, my grandfather, great-grandfather were there, and you're going, so they have the first say about how that should be managed, and not people that have been here and worked here and know a lot about the landscape. And someone comes out and tells me, oh, I should be doing something, you've never been here. That's disconcerting, to say the least, and I don't think it's helpful in the long run. It's just going to create more distrust and more animosity.
I think part of it too was that you're afraid to push back against that because right away you're racist, and well, no, I'm trying to look out for what I believe to be best. But if it's counter to what First Nations is saying or declaring, then right away you're anything that you have to say beyond that is discounted. You're just a racist. And no, that's not true. It's the fact of the matter is I have genuine legitimate concerns around this. But now because I've been painted with that brush, my voice is just considered to be a hiding symbol, and that's not fair either.
Yeah, so I would say again, and Jesse probably has some good stuff. It's how we frame the conversation, I think, in a lot of ways, right? So, and again, not to make it personal, but you said something earlier that was about me personally, right?
It wasn't directed.
No, but you said it, or like our MLAs, the politicians here make promises that they don't keep, and how do we keep them accountable? That's very different than saying, because I am the MLA, I happen to be the MLA for here. And so that I receive that as an attack on me, which is fine. And again, I'm happy to have the conversation. But so there's different ways to even just how we engage in the conversations, right? So you talk about the difference between how am I engaging this where I get painted as racist rhetoric versus not. And Jamie had a good way of like you framed it, I think. You talked about the difference there, right? Like coming into those conversations and working with the nations in terms of saying, we're concerned about the future. It's a very different, I would say, lens and approach to the conversation. So how we enter it matters, I think. And again, I think part of what the original question was about is how do we make sure we're having those conversations, it's not all behind closed doors. And that's I think a really good, that's a great advocacy, right? To say, how do we do this in a way that we have our voice at the table? And part of it is through, frankly, the association is through the people like Jesse at BCWF to be able to have those conversations and make sure we have that voice that's heard to the people that are in Victoria, right? other piece I was gonna say is like, what's my role? What's my role as an MLA here, right? So we're talking, we're kind of bridging between the politics side of things and the MLA side of things. MLA side of things, I'm here to listen to what you guys have to say and to help make sure that people of Victoria hear that, right? It doesn't matter what party colors you want to fly or anything else, right? That's my job, is to listen to everybody and advocate for what's happening out there. My role.
How frustrating is it?
Well, like I said, I say like really sincerely. Yesterday I was like, not really great in the sense that I'm gonna say, okay, I'm done. I'm like, stop at work tomorrow. But I'm like, like it's the challenge there of trying to advocate for what we know, and it's not again, this isn't a partisan political thing. It's just the reality of like, as you guys know, as Barry knows, as all of us know, trying to create that change is really hard, right? And it takes an enormous amount of work, and it takes enough of a voice and enough recognition of that voice to be able to say, this really matters and we have to deliver on it for our community, whatever our community might be. So
The big awards, just to interrupt everybody. Getting back to Jesse's original comments, that is strictly right across, getting away from all this social shit, getting to a science-based decision. Whether it be forestry management, wildlife management, whatever, I don't give a shit what it is. It has to be science-based, get away from the social shit. Doesn't matter what party or what group you're talking about. I know it's impossible, it's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
That simplifies things. All this confusion, that's the simplest. Done.
okay, so again, we could talk for a long time. I'll try to keep this short. I came out of the world of science before I got into politics, which was another story. I was in the world of science, and I was in the world of science because I cared about. I started in conservation biology, doing a bunch of forestry work, BBC, schooled on ecology is what I do, right? That's where my heart really is. That's why I like the ecosystem health framework. It's because it matters for this stuff. The challenge is all of the information in the world in terms of the science is not enough to change where we're going politically unless people are advocating for that change, right? And so I hear you. I get a ton of communication that says more science-based management. It's like, okay, that's fine. That's the world I came out of. So it's like, I understand that. But at some point, again, I say, the reality is that the governance of our area, whether that's local, federal, provincial, otherwise, governance is about taking the science, taking the insights of what we know is going to happen. That we talked about, a parent competition. We talked, all of that stuff is science. But there's no, okay, muleys versus whitetail. Like, the science is not straightforward. It doesn't tell us what to do. It tells us what's going to happen when we do certain things. Jesse mentioned moose management. Look back to wildlife, how we managed forestry 100 years ago. We were just managing for tons and tons of edge, so we had lots and lots of ungulates, and that worked. That's science-based management, but it's the value structure in Victoria at the time that was saying, we care about ungulates, and we're going to manage our forest for ungulates at the expense of whatever else we might want out of that forest. So it's like my encouragement to you on the advocacy piece there is add the next layer of that question. So I get communication saying, we want to see science-based management. I think I understand what that means, but tell me the next layer. Tell me what you mean, right? Does that mean you want me to invest in advocating for quagga and zebra mussel restrictions at the border? Which makes sense. That's science-based management. Does that mean you're frustrated with the relationship with Indigenous partners? Well, that's a very different request. So give me the next layer. Let's give government the next layer with what you actually mean in that. I can let him. I don't want to be responsible for picking and choosing to ask you questions.
Roly, I got a question. You mentioned about that we should be more collaborative around the table around the land management stuff. So imagine you're around the table, there's 100 people, but one person holds all the power. How do you imagine the collaboration is supposed to work in that kind of environment when people aren't equal?
So, okay, and if we're talking about indigenous people at the table specifically?
Well, so say you've got all the hunters in BC, right? And then some of those are indigenous hunters, right? With the land management changes, they hold even more power than they have now. So when you have disparate amounts of power between individuals, collaboration changes. If everybody's equal, collaboration looks a lot different than if one person can say, Yeah, you gotta convince me, because I hold all the power, right? That's what I wanna understand. You talk about collaboration, explain to me how it works in the department.
We don't have equal vote, that's the big thing. Their vote
Okay.
counts 2 compared to 1.
So, you know, part of what we're getting into, again, if we're talking about indigenous relations, right, is rights and title is a real thing, right? Like, we are gonna lose the court case if, you know, like, if government is going to court around these pieces with industry, with whoever.
Ryan is sure. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. And I don't know, do you have more plans after this, or is it, yeah, okay. So I'm happy to hang out for a while. I'm not offended if people have to leave, so please feel free. It's a fair point, but also, okay, everybody always has a different level of engagement with this, right? That's why I mentioned the population map of the province, for example. So, you know, look at our old growth strategy. You know, part of, like, for me, and I'll use that as an example. So for me, okay, we have an old growth strategy. There's a lot of work that went into that. I'm proud of I think I read that before I got into provincial government. I'm happy with those recommendations. I'm happy that the government agreed to endorse all 14 recommendations. But what happens next? What then happens? And part of it then becomes a debate in terms of what happens to those people out on the land base that are engaged in forestry, that are and how is that relating to our rural communities and our indigenous partners? Because, as you know, with part of the old growth deferrals, it was to say, okay, we're opening this up now, and we're saying we're taking the science-based approach to say this is what the maps, the technical experts have recommended. We're going to go to our indigenous partners to say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to do this? Do you want to need more time? And so that relationship is what it is. They have a different voice in that, because that is partly, you know, those maps are tied to their rights and title, their areas. And at the same time, we've got a lot of very loud voices in that population map that, you know, is centered down where you used to live. And how do we balance that even, right? And that's, again, so the work that I was doing in the background there is around making sure that this is a conversation that is not either we're doing this or we're doing this, right? It's a more nuanced approach to recognize, again, our rural communities depend on healthy forestry. And that depends on making sure that the polarized voices aren't ruling the conversation. And so, you know, around that table, yeah, you know, frankly, if you're working with the Soyuz Guinea band, and, you know, they have a different set of tools, they have a different set of perspectives, and a different sense of history that they're bringing into that conversation.
Yeah, and that's understood. But so if you're trying to be more collaborative, continuing to put more power onto just a few people makes collaboration harder, not easier. So I feel like it's maybe going opposite direction than it needs to be. You're trying, and it's only going to be going to lose more court cases if you put more power on a few people. It's not going to help.
So again, I mentioned the article that I just read, right? I mean, there you have an indigenous person advocating for protection of elk corridors, essentially, right? There's opportunities there to work together, and it's, you know, I hear what you're saying, but again,
could that happen if everybody's equal though? It's still good. It doesn't mean, it's just the risk is that if you put too much power in a few hands, that one person could make decisions that could affect a ton of people, and it might not be the best decision. Sometimes it would be, but it isn't always.
I agree, right? I hear what you're saying, but I also sense that part of what you're saying is that you don't abide by the notion of rights and title, right? Which, like, because that's part of the underlying conversation we're having, right? Is does, you know, what does that voice look like, right? And that's a very, like again, I feel like that piece of the conversation, we're working with the majors in forestry, working with everybody, they recognize that this is a reality of going forward. We got to figure out how are we effectively working with our nations to do what we want to do. And you know, you mentioned Ellis. He's not my favorite colleague, but you know, Ellis is a good example, right? Like there's, you know, Ellis has been very vocal about, you know, making sure that we are focused at resource extraction, right? There's different perspectives amongst the indigenous community. I hear what you're saying, but the reality is we've got to figure out how we're doing that work productively going forward. I don't know quite what you mean, I guess, by everybody being equal around the table, because then there's also all the people that are not at the table, and how do we have 5.5 million voices that all have an equal say in what's happening to my life, for example, right? Which is a tricky. I don't know what that looks like.
So as it relates to Land Act, I think part of the challenge was that what's come out of this is there are a number of small businesses who have already been pulled here out, right? That's what came out of that, is a whole bunch of fear and anxiety around it. And so the outcome, and like we talked about this with the minister a number of times, everybody has to see themselves in the future. That's the message. We all have to be able to see that 20 years down the road, we're gonna have fish and wildlife, we're gonna be able to take our kids and enjoy it. And we're not in a position right now where province is necessarily saying this is really important to us. I think that's where you get the fear, and you get it from small businesses, is we had all kinds of, you know, guide operations where everybody across the province went fast, and this is already happening to us. So that's where the fear comes in. I think the process was rushed. We were putting regulation before consultation and writing legislation, and so there were process issues. I think those are the two big things. But the big thing in our folks' world is there's two approaches. One is where the government pokes us in the eye and says we're changing the hunting seasons for these reasons, and there's another approach that says, hey, moose are in decline in the Mitchell Golden. We're going to invest and we're going to increase the moose populations, and everyone can support that and enjoy it and share. And I think that's the message, is like there's a lot of fear and anxiety, and there's ways to make everybody better off, and there's ways to poke people in the eye. And so from our perspective, like as a federation, all of our projects now are with communities. And we were doing it before, like the Mule Deer project, we started with ONA before any of this legislation or anything even existed. So we're in for it, but everybody has to be able to see themselves in the future. And that's where the anxiety lies, is people feel like they're not going to see themselves in the future, whether it's their job or conservation or having fishing and hunting. The province needs to be strong enough to have a space to say, hey, this is really important to us. We want people out on the landscape, and this is something that's going to be at the table. There's, you know, in the days of all time too, like, you know, deputy minister, environment mines, do you want hunting or do you want the mine, right? So not being traded off for economic values is big for us. I think that's the message.
Yeah, and I hear that. I appreciate it. So I would counter. I would say I don't think that the legislative piece around the Land Act was rushed. I think that was a fairly straightforward process, and I don't think it impacted nearly what people thought it was impacting, and that communication became very garbled. The first part of what you described, though, 100% agree. I think that the challenges there around that process were more about everything else that's happened than the actual land, the amendments. So let's separate those two things, right? And the positive out of all that is it's front and center on the conversation, and we're having this dialogue. This dialogue is happening in Victoria. So that absolutely, I agree with that, right? And it's the challenge of the same as what Court is describing, right? How are we navigating this in a good way in our communities, in a way like recognizing realities of living in 2024? How are we moving forward in a way so that our children can see a future that they like in our rural communities? And so hearing on that, yeah. I would say so one of the things that so I have a colleague that's been in Victoria, has been in MLA for 20 years, and he came up to me 2 days ago and said, he lives in a rural community, said, in the 20 years that I've been here, I have not seen as strong of a voice in our caucus for rural, for the advancing the kind of rural voice as I have now. And he's, he was saying he's talking about how phase is, right? Part of the work that I have had the opportunity to do with some other colleagues around rural BC is to say, to really try to like focus that perspective on how are we actually, what are we doing in Victoria and how does that land in rural communities? Because that lens on government decision making does not exist in a consistent way across government. And so that has been a persistent advocacy piece internally with our own party to say, okay, we want to make sure this happens. In September, Premier got to the point where he acknowledged at UBCM in front of thousands of people, said we're going to work to build out a rural lens for the government of BC, so that we know that those things are landing. Those are the sorts of pieces to me. So like that's a piece of work that I get the honor to be able to kind of shepherd through the process, which is not simple, as you can imagine, but because it means working with the Ministry of Housing, it means working with the Ministry of Agriculture, all of them. That's to make sure that we're doing a better job of the first part of your question, which I think is really good, which is how do we avoid a Westwold situation this summer? How do we make sure we're managing water in a good way and engaging communities? How do we make sure when we have healthcare policy that's coming forward that it's something that works in communities that don't have easy transportation from here to trail, right? And so that work is the optimistic piece. You ended on that hope slide, which I like a lot. That's the optimistic piece for me, is that we're figuring out how to do a better job of navigating to alleviate worries and concerns, right? Like, how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're engaging the right people at the right time and making sure communities are involved? And that is back to that, making sure that government is investing in people and listening to the people. And that's part of, that's why we have a budget with a big deficit, is because we're trying to figure out how we need to make sure we invest in people so that they get the supports they need. And the rural piece is around making sure we have the right voice for what rural community needs.
Last question.
It's not all that constructive, but what I get from listening to all this is, I'm not a hunter, by the way. I shot politicians for 14 years, but with a camera. Politics is something I kind of know a little bit more about than hunting. But in the beginning of this discussion, it was like, okay, well, this government is Victoria. We have to get them to, in a sense, straighten up, fly right, and realize what the real situation is. But when you think about what a previous speaker was pointing out, over 100 years ago, that would have been easy, because Victoria could have just said, oh yeah, this is the way it's going to be, and make the change. It's not the way it is anymore. You have the First Nations, and they have rights, and the government now respects what they say and listens to what they say, so they have a certain amount of power. So you really shouldn't think of this as one province with one provincial government. You should think of this as something like the European Union or NATO, because all those First Nations have their own agendas, and their people, rightly or wrongly, are going to be pursuing the agendas that either work for them or their people first, and not the rest of you. So if you want to lobby government to get on your side, I think you're going to have to actually start lobbying all those individual governments that the big government, Victoria, pays attention to get the idea that what's good for you and all of us is good for them, so that you can be part of their agenda. So when they go to lobby with the government and talk to the government, they're on the side with you. That's all. It's just a matter of perspective, but we're not living in a one government in Victoria situation anymore. That's all.
I think that's the point. Is very well taken. I had the opportunity to go speak to a group the conversation around social determinants of health, which is basically like everything in our communities. But it was all the indigenous nations around these. So 205 different nations coming together to debate what they wanted to move for, what they wanted to commit to on action for their communities, for their nations. That group, so I got a chance to present, and then we had a huge room full of people, as you can imagine. I think 198 of them, 198 of the nations are obviously come together to join the conversation. And there's very few people, frankly, that were not part of one of those nations in the room of a couple thousand people. They spent all day debating about what they wanted to do in terms of agreeing on the wording for resolution around health for their members, for their people. And that to me is indicative of just what Les is saying, right? 205 independent nations, right? This is very different from talking to, coming together and talking to a room full of different forestry businesses where, people can agree, disagree, whatever, you get to a conclusion, move forward. Right? These are all independent. They can do whatever they want to do, so they don't get to that point of consensus. This makes things very difficult. So yeah, like that's the landscape that we're operating in now, and recognizing how do we build those relationships. Actually, my kind of believe like we got to figure out how to work together, and we don't always have to agree, right? I don't have to agree with you, but we can have a respectful working relationship that we can figure out how to do what we need to get done and agree. Okay, here's the things that I'm willing to see and sacrifice, and you didn't do the same, and then we move forward.
Roly, there's a small example of reconciliation on Vancouver Island. Outfitters, resident hunters, First Nation hunters do a pretty good deal on how to manage the rules of it all. I can't give you the skinny on it. That story is from Dave. Irish white outfitters, we know the class guys. Don Henderson, the Redwood Tree, I know well, my son knows well. He's kind of monitoring, so they do control harvest by First Nation. First Nation into that game. It's a small example, but the way things are going on the land base, they're going to be the dominant player. And if we can get them to play the game that we're doing in that Redwood program, we got some hope.
Yeah, there's I think pretty, regardless of what domain you're talking about, there's pretty cool examples somewhere around this province of neat work taking place. And part of that work on the rural front is recognizing as rural people, we're all pretty fiercely independent. We're all going to solve the problems we need to solve, however we need to solve them. We need to make sure that government recognizes those creative models and supports them, even if they don't fit whatever good cutter approach that they have. And so like using those models to be able to advocate for that moving forward is a great example, right? And there's, you name the situation, there's probably some example out there in the province of a relationship that has been built that is working well to deliver whatever it is we're trying to deliver for our communities.
Okay, we're gonna end it there, guys, to see everybody's getting antsy.
Can I just add, so thank you, again, appreciate the conversation, please, sincerely, I'm happy to have a follow-up and maybe we talk about that.
We'd love to have you back, we'd love to have everybody together.
Yeah.
Election.
Yeah, and I would say, to this conversation around like, the advocacy in terms of the on-ramp to the voice election, the question is like, how do we have the best voice that we can have in Victoria, right? But that's part of what I think we need to get the promises from the parties. And this is where the difference between what individuals say and the parties say. You need to get those promises from the parties. They also need to figure out how do you have the best voice that you could have in Victoria, and that should be part of that question with whoever is standing up here wearing a political hat in front. So again, thank you all. I appreciate it, and I'm glad that there was only one kind of veiled threat of being shot. That's great.
Not many politicians stick their neck out for wildlife.
Okay, big thank you for Roly, taking time out of his busy schedule. And Jesse, he's a pretty hard guy to pin down. He's representing over 40,000 or less at the BC Wildlife Federation right now, probably the busiest guy in the province. And really appreciate it, big hand for him.